At some point, you stopped trying. Maybe it was in a relationship. Maybe it was with a dream you kept chasing and kept getting nowhere with. Maybe it was with a person in your life who kept disappointing you no matter how many chances you gave them. And somewhere along the way, you started calling that version of yourself the one who stopped weak, lazy, someone who quit, someone who gave up. And that story, the story that the you who stopped was a failure, is the one you've been carrying ever since. I want to offer you a different story today because I don't think that version of you gave up. I think that version of you did something incredibly intelligent that your conscious mind hadn't yet figured out how to do on its own. I think that version of you was protecting you, and I think it's time you stopped being ashamed of it. Stay with me. When the human nervous system experiences repeated pain, repeated disappointment, repeated rejection, repeated failure to get a need met, it doesn't just passively absorb that experience, it adapts. And one of the most sophisticated adaptations it makes is to reduce the intensity of effort in the direction that keeps producing pain. This is not weakness. This is your system doing exactly what it was designed to do. A body that keeps running toward a wall and getting hurt does not lack willpower when it eventually stops running. It has learned something real and important, that this particular direction, at this particular time, with this particular level of preparation or support, is not working, and it is protecting you from further damage while you figure out a different way. The problem is not that you shut down. The problem is the story you told about it afterward. The story that it meant something permanent about your character. The story that people who really wanted something never stopped trying. The story that your stopping was evidence of a fundamental flaw in you rather than a completely rational response to a genuinely painful set of circumstances. You were not weak, you were worn, and worn is not the same as broken. Worn means you tried. Worn means you gave it everything you had at the time. Worn means the stopping was earned, not chosen. The version of you that stopped was not your worst self. It was a self that had finally reached its honest limit and chose survival over performance. What exactly were you protecting yourself from? Because naming it matters, not to excuse the stopping, but to understand it well enough to move beyond it with something other than shame. You were protecting yourself from more disappointment. If you had given that relationship everything and it still ended, trying as hard again with someone new felt like agreeing to risk that specific kind of pain again. Stopping wasn't choosing loneliness. It was choosing not to be destroyed twice in the same way. You were protecting yourself from more public failure. Every time you tried something and it didn't work out and other people could see it, a part of you registered not just the failure but the exposure, the being seen failing. Stopping removed that exposure. It wasn't laziness, it was the very human desire to not be watched losing anymore. You were protecting yourself from more hope. This is the one most people don't name. Hope is painful when it keeps not paying off. Genuine hope, the kind where you really believe something is possible, makes the eventual disappointment much worse than if you hadn't hoped at all. Stopping trying was a way of stopping hoping, which was a way of stopping the specific kind of pain that comes from hope that gets extinguished repeatedly. All of these are intelligent responses to real pain, not permanent solutions, not the right long-term strategy, but real, understandable human responses from a self that was doing the best it could with what it had at the time. I want to tell you about someone. She had wanted to write for as long as she could remember. She had started 3 different projects over 5 years and abandoned all of them. By the third time, she walked away from something she'd been working on for months. She had a clear diagnosis for herself. She was someone who started things and didn't finish them. She was fundamentally undisciplined. She was the kind of person who wanted things but didn't do the work to get them. What she hadn't examined was what had happened each time she stopped. The first time, she had shown her writing to someone who mattered to her and received a response so dismissive it had taken the air out of everything. The second time, she had shared it publicly and the silence had been worse than criticism. The third time, she had genuinely tried to push through all of that history and had produced something she was proud of, and then sat on it for 6 months, unable to share it because every version of sharing had previously ended in a kind of small grief. She wasn't sure she could survive again. She wasn't someone who didn't finish things. She was someone who had been hurt in a very specific way, in a very specific context, enough times that her system had learned. Sharing this part of yourself leads to pain. Stop sharing. Protect the thing that matters. The stopping wasn't failure. It was her most valuable self being kept safe by the only method available to her at the time. Understanding that didn't make starting again easy, but it made it possible because she wasn't fighting her own weakness anymore. She was working with her own intelligence, building the conditions under which sharing felt survivable again. So how do you actually move forward when the version of you that stopped was doing it for real reasons? First, thank the part that stopped. This is not a metaphor. Actually acknowledge internally that the stopping had a reason, that it was intelligent, that it protected something real. The part of you that shut down did not need to be overcome or defeated. It needs to understand that the conditions have changed enough that trying again is safer than it was last time. Second, identify specifically what you were protecting yourself from. Name it as precisely as you can. Not just I was afraid of failure, but what kind of failure, in front of whom, meaning what about you? The more specific you are, the more you can actually address the real fear rather than trying to motivate your way past it with willpower that doesn't touch the actual wound. Third, build a smaller, safer version of the attempt, one that still moves you forward but doesn't require the same level of exposure that hurt you before. Not because you're permanently limiting yourself, but because trust, including the trust you need to rebuild with yourself, is built gradually through repeated small experiences of safety rather than one enormous leap that asks you to ignore everything you previously learned. You are not starting over. You are starting from a different place, one where you understand yourself better and can build something more solid than before. If you have been carrying shame about a version of yourself that stopped, I want you to hear this. That version of you was not your worst self. It was a self that had been hurt enough times that it needed to stop in order to survive. That is not weakness. That is one of the most fundamental acts of self-preservation a person can make. Even when it looks from the outside and sometimes even from the inside, like giving up. You are allowed to have stopped. You are allowed to still be stopped right now. You are allowed to need more time, more safety, more evidence that trying again won't cost you what it cost you last time. None of that is failure. All of that is human. And when you are ready, not pressured, not shamed, not motivated by someone telling you you've been hiding long enough, but genuinely ready, even just ready to consider being ready, the version of you that stopped will not be your obstacle. It will be your most honest guide because it knows exactly what went wrong last time. And that knowledge is the most useful thing you can bring into whatever comes next. If this names something you've been carrying quietly, share it with someone who needs to hear that their stopping made sense. My name is Zoni. Subscribe. This channel is for the parts of yourself you haven't been able to explain yet. The version of you that stopped trying was not giving up, it was holding on.